Welcome to The Lover's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. As always, you're with Mike
and Ian
as we reread the Aubrey Matron canon of Patrick O'Brien. Ian, we're just about done with this canon at slow pace. Tell us, where were we last time and what do we have to look forward to today?
Absolutely, Mike. Last time we were in the second to last chapter with the East India Company showering HMS Surprise with thanks for their work against the French. Canning, meanwhile, in a further show of gratitude, had provided freight money, allowing Jack to send for Sophie with the purpose of making what you might call an honest woman of her. Canning had walked in on Diana as she was turning down Stephen's marriage proposal. Canning had handed out a slap to Stephen, and in the ensuing duel, Canning wounded Stephen, who then fired left-handed and missed his aim, not the intended glancing blow, but a shot that was fatal for Canning. That was last time. This time, Mike, we've got one last chapter for you and me, filled with all things Aubrey and Maturin and Patrick O'Brien. We're in the closing chapter of HMS Surprise. Jack and Stephen are heading for home. They're hoping to stop in Madeira and pick up their respected loves. Stephen's attempting to recover from the wound that he got from Canning. Diana and Stephen decide where to go from here. Jack is pretty sure about where to go from here. He's looking for action. He's looking for a prize along the way. And for us, well, we've got classical references. We're going to get werewolves, misdirection, surprises, with the pun intended. And as always, Mike, no straight path ahead to paradise.
Oh, isn't it ever so?
Isn't it ever so? Anyway, we start out not yet in paradise, right?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, we start out with Jack bringing a note from Stephen, delivering it to Diana at Canning's house. Now, we note that the tigers on the porch are all gone. The servants are carrying things away. And Diana, first question is, how is Stephen? Jack says he's very low. His fever's very high. The bullet is lodged. And of course, they're worried about infection, here in this Indian climate here. Well, Diana is really upset by Jack's hard, cold anger. And she can't help but notice how changed he is from the Jack that she remembers. He's bigger, more formidable. The boy is completely gone. Now, Jack hands her the note. She excuses herself and reads it. And Stephen is telling her to take the Lushington back to Europe, that he's basically in kind of coded language saying, I'm going to cover all your expenses and you can rely on me at all times, something he repeats twice. This in a very shaky hand. Well, reading this, through her tears, Diana looks up again at Jack, who in his anger has turned his back on her, not even looking at her anymore.
And Mike, this is a really, really deep emotional scene here between Jack and Diana, but it really highlights to me how different this is from when they were last kind of in direct company with each other toward the end of Post Captain. And I think at that time, Diana had one up on Jack because she was the powerful, desirable kind of woman about town, and he was, I didn't agree with her, but I think she had a half of a fair point when she called him out for being a bit of a coward. But this time, I think Jack's absolutely got the authority, and Diana is hanging on to her authority and her position with her fingernails here. Jack is trying to identify for himself the feelings that lie underneath the immediate anger and distaste that he's got for being there with Diana. And rarely for Jack, we get a bit of introspection. He thinks that he only really feels righteousness, like the feeling of being in a high moral position, in the cases of faulty seamanship and offences against naval discipline, of which this is definitely not one of either of those two things. And he wonders to himself, with a bit of rare for Jack introspection here, am I a scrub? He's asking himself. Am I, in fact, a hypocrite? Is it me that's in the wrong for being hostile to this woman, the pursuit of whom almost wrecked my career? She, on that occasion, had preferred Canning, and he's asking himself, is my holier-than-thou attitude or indignation. Is it real or is it just resentment? Is it kind of pitiful? And he tells himself, as a way of restoring the kind of moral balance of his calculation here, that she hurt Stephen, his particular friend, terribly. And now Canning, who at least in Jack's eyes is a reasonably fine man, is dead. And he puts that at her door. She, he says to himself, is no good at all. The duel, he realizes, could just as easily have been over a virtuous woman. So the fact that Stephen and Canning fought over her doesn't necessarily make her bad. It's his own kind of new reflection on Diana's role here that's kind of bringing him some new thoughts. Jack, when he was single and pursuing her, had attacked her virtue, that is to say, had pursued her as hard as he could. So he's not without blame here. But he takes no consolation for himself in the kind of hypocritical or sanctimonious statement that might be mouthed by many, that it is different for men. So really fascinating changing of the balance between Jack and Diana. And what really strikes me here, Mike, is Jack really understands the world and his place in it a bit better than he did a book ago.
Yeah, amazingly so.
Yeah.
Jack sees he's turned away. He's kind of looking out the window, and the most beautiful horse he thinks that he's ever seen, this chestnut mare, is coming up the driveway, and she shies at a snake. And I couldn't help but think, wait a minute, a woman shying away from a snake. Doesn't it sound terribly like Eve in the Garden of Eden and the snake here?
Yeah.
And then I thought, well, wait a minute. Is this mare, like Eve, kind of like Diana, sort of, if you will, entrapped by the situation in which she finds herself? Yes, she does make sometimes her own poor choices, but there are these greater forces at play that we've been reading about throughout O'Brien. And perhaps Jack is realizing that he's been, as he just kind of confessed to himself, one of those forces at play, using these societal roles prescribed for men and women hypocritically here. And perhaps the rider who's just directed his horse into the path of the snake is another one of those forces. But perhaps I reflect too much. In the meantime, Jack admires this mare. He's thinking to himself, she's perfectly proportioned, she's light, she's powerful. And with that thought in mind, he turns around and he looks at Diana, and he's thinking, he's been thinking about virtue, and he thinks, virtue, I esteem courage the most, because I think all the other virtues are really included in courage. And then he's thinking, well, even though Diana looks so ghost-like, so straight and slim and frail that I could break her with one hand, nevertheless, she has courage without a doubt. And thinking about Diana and how courageous she has always been and is being now, the text says, a tenderness and admiration he had thought quite dead moved in him.
Wow. So really fascinating flow from the two passages there. There's the passage of actually, sincerely, with a new perspective, Jack feels hostile to Diana. And then with half a step back and a metaphor at hand, he realizes another kind of admiration that he has for her. And that says a lot about the duality of her character. It says a little bit as well about the duality of his character and men. I think it's really, really great writing. Meanwhile, a servant announces a name that's going to be important to us. He announces the name of a Mr. Johnston. He's going to get named Johnson also under the parts of the canon, but trust us, it's the same guy. Diana says in reply to this announcement that she's not at home, and Johnston, or Johnson as he may be, rides off again. And Diana turns to Jack and asks if she could ride home in the Surprise. And we know that Stephen had asked her to marry him, so maybe she could be his nurse to help him through his convalescence. And Jack gives the straight answer, I think the only answer that he can give, which is no, it's against regulations. In any case, they won't be leaving for a month. There's refitting work still to be done. The Lushington, the merchantman, meanwhile, sails in a week, and he offers her assistance if she might need it so that he can sail on the ship. And I guess by assistance, he is implying money to pay the passage. And she gets back up on the medium-high horse that she has left and says, I always knew you were a weak man, Aubrey, but I did not know you were a scrub. There you go. That's the the phrase that he's already been thinking about. I did not know you were a scrub. You are much the same as every man I have ever known except for Maturin. False, weak, and a coward in the end.
Wow.
So, the problem that she has with Canning is he was false and weak and a coward. And if she's going to look for any new man, it's going to be somebody who is none of at least some of those things.
Right.
And Jack now, once again, is tormented by his earlier question, right?
Yeah. To his credit, he doesn't say anything. He bows, leaves the room, leaves the house. But as he's walking back to the ship, he continues to be tormented by this question. Am I indeed a scrub? While he's kind of bedeviled by that, he sees Surprise's tall mainmast in the distance, kind of towering above everything. And he starts to walk faster, then runs up the gangway and calls for McAllister. McAllister tells him Stephen's fever is too high.
Wow.
We're hoping that it'll come down once the ball is removed. And Jack says, well, shouldn't we just take him to the hospital on shore? McAllister said he had suggested the same thing, particularly when they realized that the bullet is wedged right under the pericardium, the membrane enclosing the heart. But Dr. Maturin would not hear of it. He insists on performing his own operation on the ship. And McAllister is currently taking Stephen's hand-drawn plans for an extractor to the armorer to be created kind of from whole cloth here.
Wow. So Stephen is bent on self-surgery, and we'll talk a little bit about some references behind this when we get to the actual moment. But while the armorer is busy making this extractor, this instrument, Jack goes and pays Stephen a visit, and he's there in this cabin, very light and airy, and there's this large mirror hanging over Stephen, and you can probably guess what the mirror's for. Stephen says thank you to Jack for taking the note to Diana, and wonders whether she was dressed in black. And he's wondering whether she's in mourning in some way, publicly mourning for Canning. And Jack says that she wasn't. Jack offers to open the skylight to admit some more air to help with Stephen's fever. And Stephen says, no, the fever is not what's clouding my mind. And Jack says, well, maybe we should have the hospital doctor here to help. But Stephen, as he points out to Jack, is set on doing this with his own hand. And he says, almost to himself, looking at his hand, if the hand could undertake the one task, it must undertake the other. That is but justice. And it's funny, I read that from Stephen, and I thought that actually sounds a little bit more like a Jack speaking. That sounds like a naval person. It sounds a little bit like a superstition rather than a rational man. But I think he's kind of deep in philosophy rather than in science here.
I think you're exactly right. I think this is Stephen's morality.
Yeah.
I called him out. I shot him with this hand. I killed him with this hand. All right, so this hand is going to have to be what either rescues or doesn't rescue me here.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which is a big burden to place on one dodgy hand that was in bits from the attentions of the French only a book ago.
Right.
Anyhow, in comes the new extractor, the instrument that this hand is going to wield. Stephen inspects it, and Jack offers to help with the procedure, assuring Stephen that blood doesn't bother him, given all the wounds that he's seen in battle. And I love this rejoinder that's here in the text. Blood he had seen, to be sure, but not blood, not this cold, deliberate ooze in the slow track of the searching knife and probe. Nor had he heard anything like the grind of the demi-lune on living bone a few inches from his ear as he leaned over the wound, his head bent low, not to obscure Stephen's view in the mirror. And Mike, I can't say I love this passage because it's really grim reading. It's really hard to read, but it's really beautifully written. It's also an interesting reference back to part of the movie for different reasons and in a different context. Paul Bettany's Stephen Maturin does self-surgery on himself to remove a bullet, and Russell Crowe's Jack Aubrey, looking very queasy, can hardly stay with the procedure as he's there helping to kind of apply pressure and help Stephen to navigate the wound. Really grim stuff. Here we go. The time has come, I think, to figure out whether this procedure can work or not.
Right. And Jack in the book, like Russell Crowe in the movie, is indeed overwhelmed. Yeah. He's listening to Stephen ordering McAllister to raise his ribs, snip the cartridge, and then he's really taken aback by the brutal force that's applied to Stephen's body and then this constant swabbing up of blood. Stephen tells Jack to continue that steady downward pressure on the belly. Stephen, meanwhile, takes this new extractor. Jack looks into the throbbing cavity, sees this leaden gleam down below. Stephen holds his breath, arches his back, grunts, and pulls the bullet out, hands it to McAllister, who says, "Whole, sir, by God, quite whole. Not a morsel left. Oh, brawly feckit." Gosh, I wish I could do a Scottish accent. But brawly feckit, bravely done. So, love that. Love that. Here you go. We need Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson, come in here. Do this.
No.
No, of course we don't.
I think there's a spectrum of authenticity in movie making. And
yes.
English Russell Crowe is high at one end of the spectrum. Scottish Mel Gibson is very far at the other end of the spectrum.
Exactly right. Baby Scotty.
Aye, Captain.
Our story, right? Aye.
So after all of this, Stephen is still conscious and he sees Jack and gets McAllister to look after Jack while Stephen swabs his own wound. Jack is heaved into a chair by McAllister. His head's pushed down between his knees. McAllister hands him some smelling salts, and Jack looks up and sees Stephen's face. Barely human, grey face, says the text, glistening with sweat. And this look of surly, dogged triumph on the face of Stephen Maturin. And I can't think of anything more likely to cause surly triumph on my face than if I had successfully dug a ball out of my own abdomen. Anyway, Jack's eyes move down to the wound and he takes in Stephen's chest. It says here, ploughed open from side to side, deep, deep, and white bone bare. Like, we're not spared any of what it is that's ailing Jack Aubrey here. McAllister closes Stephen's wound, sharing in the triumph, and proudly announces the time, 23 minutes from first incision to closure. Sounding, Mike, a little bit like Jack Aubrey paying attention to the time between gunnery broadsides, but rather a different context and rather a different pace. Stephen says, slow, meaning that was quite a long time under the knife. Meaning further that there's now some risk of infection. This is not going to be a straightforward thing to recover from. Before finally Stephen turns to Jack and reminds him that he's about to be late for dinner ashore. And almost superhuman, actually superhuman, just doggedness and physical courage and tenacity from Stephen Maturin here. If he can stand this, surely, Mike, he can withstand anything.
Yeah. I mean, it to me, like you said, like sounding like Jack after a great gun exercise. This is Stephen in action, in his action, just like Jack is such a, his own action. It's just amazing here, and its effect is still not lost on Jack. Jack's kind of protesting, no, I'm not going to dinner. But McAllister kind of puts his finger to his lips and pushes him out the door, thinking, look. This, the doctor needs to rest. You need to get out of here. And outside the door, of course, there's the whole crew basically assembled, waiting for news. And I think Jack sort of pushes through them, tells Pullings to make sure there's no noise abaft the mainmast tonight, none whatsoever. And Bonded, seeing Jack's pale face, says, "Come, let's go have a dram here." As they are back alone in the cabin, Jack says, "Christ, Bonded. He opened himself up slowly with his own hands right to the heart. I saw it beating there." Jack's still so caught up in this moment. And Bonded, I love Bonded. And, the reason the crew's there. "Ah, sir, there's surgery for you," said Bonded, passing the glass. It would not surprise any old Sophie, however. Such a learned article. "You remember the gunner, sir? Never let it put you off your dinner. He'll be as right as a trivet. Never you fret, sir." So Bonded caring for Jack the way McAllister's caring for Stephen here. And, just this, it's like, Jack, remember who we're talking about here. This is Stephen in surgery. We're not worried.
Right. At least we're not worried about him physically. Let's just say that.
Yeah, good point.
So Jack then goes into town, goes ashore after Killick gets him dressed. He's mostly silent. He eats the dinner and drinks the wine until he overhears a deaf old judge talking with a portly member of council about Canning's unpopularity and what should be done with the woman. Now, we haven't had very many judges yet in the canon. We're still only at HMS Surprise. Not much of a spoiler to say. Judges get a bad rap all the way through the canon, and they are privileged and self-absorbed and heartless and judgmental. And here's the prototype for a self-absorbed, heartlessly cruel judge saying, I want to hear more about the fire-eating Irish sawbones, having suggested that Diana, meaning the woman in this case, should be flogged at a cart's tail. At this point, they're about to really cause some problems around the table. An aide comes up behind the judge and his companion and whispers in their ears. And the judge says, "Oh, I wasn't aware," and looks at Jack. And Mike, what we get from Jack now, to my ear, is delivered in a Stephen Maturin kind of blunt, cold, direct tone. "You are speaking of my friend, Dr. Maturin, sir. I trust the woman to whom you have referred is in no way connected with the lady who honours Maturin and me with her acquaintance." No, they assured him. They had meant not the least offence to the gentleman, would be happy to withdraw any facetious expression, would never dream of speaking of a lady known to Captain Aubrey with disrespect. They hoped he would drink a glass of wine with them. "By all means," said he. And presently the judge was led away. And if the judge has got half a brain, he's thinking the last person to come between Stephen Maturin and the respectable love he has for his woman ended up dead on the ground. So very wise to suffer merely the short-term humiliation at the dinner table rather than kind of stick to your guns. Very smart move by the judge's aide.
Absolutely. Well, Jack seems to be in a bit of a different spirit in the morning when he receives Diana on board the Surprise. And, Diana thinks with much less rigor than she'd expected.
Yeah.
Like she's waiting to see the same Jack. This is a different Jack now. Stephen, he says, is sleeping, but why don't you go talk with McAllister? He'll tell you all about Stephen's condition. And if Stephen wakes, he can take you in to see him. Jack sends down all the refreshments the Surprise has to offer to her, but Stephen doesn't wake. So Jack invites her to return and offers any of his officers to help her to see her, home and back through the docks, through the town. She says, "Well, I would like Mr. Babington's protection in my coming and going." So here's we're renewing an old acquaintance with that. We don't have the bean-fed horse, but we have Diana.
Where's the horse
Babington
in this situation?
Right.
And by the way, this says to me that at least a little Babington has moved on. Like, he is such a hound for the ladies that I would not have trusted, the younger midshipman Babington within yards of a woman like Diana Villiers. But anyhow, he's trusted enough to give her an honourable, respectable escort around town. He's beside himself when she comes to visit on the Friday. Jack is able happily to report to her that Stephen had eaten an egg, is feeling considerably better, but still has a high fever. So he's got high fever. He had a prolonged surgical exposure. I don't think we can say that he's anywhere near out of the woods yet. Diana brings Stephen some mangosteens, some fruit, and promises that she won't tire or vex him. She's willing to submit to McAllister's orders. Stephen claims in his own part that he's as strong as an ox. Infinitely recovered, he says, by the sight of Diana there. She thanks him for his note and says she's following his directions, and he tries to give her an envelope of money. Now, this is maybe analogous to the support that Jack Aubrey had offered, which had been flung back in his face. He calls it an envelope of money for bread and butter, and she explains that she sold a big emerald. This is a woman who has jewels about her person. She sold one of them, this big emerald, has all the bread and butter and jam that she needs, and she's booked the only decent cabin aboard the Indiaman, the Lushington. She says that she's leaving everything of Canning's behind. I don't know if that's apart from the emerald, or if she claims the emerald as hers to begin with. She wants to show the gossipers of the city what kind of woman she is, so she hasn't cleaned out Canning's possessions here. Stephen expresses the wish that maybe she could have waited to come in the Surprise, and had she thought of asking Jack. And rather graciously, given the tone of the conversation earlier on between Jack and Diana, she simply says she didn't think to ask him. How stupid of me, she said about herself. Never mind, she says that she can appreciate the maids aboard the Lushington. Stephen won't have the discomforting sight of seeing her seasick the whole way, and maybe they can catch up in Madeira, where the ships are due to call, or even London. And looking ahead, at least from Stephen Maturin's point of view, Mike, this is all still pretty promising, right?
Yeah, this is sounding great. It sounds like Stephen is in smooth waters, especially having just shot the guy that she was with. I'm kind of thinking this is all good, and it continues to be good. Stephen is exhausted, whatever he's saying, so he mostly lies there looking a little grave and transparent, but deeply happy. And she's talking. She says, she knows Aubrey's going to take great care of Stephen, and she wonders aloud, I wonder if Aubrey will make as good a husband as he does a friend. And then she answers her own question saying, well, Aubrey just doesn't know a thing about women. Well, they continue on. They get to the point of, she's saying her goodbyes, explains that the Lushington sails at this ungodly hour of the morning at high tide. She kissed him and her tears dropped on his face, the book says. And I'm wondering, well, wait a minute. Why is she crying? Let's stick a pin in that. Is she wishing that she was coming home in the surprise? Is it something else?
The surprise now is finally on the way home. We've fast forwarded to the surprise being well in the offing and en route from Calcutta back to England. The Lushington is 2,000 miles ahead of her. And here's what's happened so far aboard the surprise in one short sentence. She carried a sodden, disgruntled, flabby crew, a steel box filled with rubies, sapphires, and pearls in chamois bags, a raving surgeon, and an anxious commander. So things are going fine for Jack from the freight point of view, but his friend is in the grip of fever. This is a cause of anxiety for Jack. He sits alone with Stephen throughout the night watches, and since the fever had spiked, Stephen, who otherwise is a proud and secret man, had begun pouring out all his secrets, talking whilst he was unconscious. Official secrets, private secrets, things that Jack knows that Stephen, who is a very proud man, a man as proud as Lucifer, it says, that Stephen would not want anyone to know. So Jack is protecting his friend's honor and decency, if you like, by staying with him and being the sounding board, the buffer for all of the stuff that's coming tumbling out in Stephen's delirium. All of Stephen's naked statements of desire, statements about his weaknesses are laid bare, and Jack has to listen to all of this. Talk of adultery, of fornication, imagined conversations with Canning, even, and I think this is meant to be a funny aside, even a warning to Jack. Stephen, the delirious Stephen, says if he continues his unchastity, he will pierce himself with his own weapon, which is a very profound statement that Jack should pay attention to. Stephen, as a bastard, as somebody born illegitimately, emphasizes with Canning's slights and also the slights of being a Jew. And with all of this tumbling out of Stephen, delirious as we say, Jack sponges him throughout the night. As the watches change, he's just glad that no one else is listening to this and thankful that the ship can run perfectly smoothly in the control of his officers while Jack is down here looking after Stephen.
Yeah. And Jack, is going through all of this. He's exhausted kind of night after night. And he listens as Stephen discusses the human state as a whole. Now, something O'Brien does quite well throughout the canon. Right. Yeah. Jack listens exhausted as Stephen discusses the human state as a whole, something we love O'Brien doing. Yeah. And Stephen quotes entire chapters of Melina and the Nicomachean Ethics. Now, we'll come back to those here in a minute. Jack's embarrassed and ashamed to hear some of it. He's always viewed Stephen as this really strong philosopher, rightly sure of himself, untouched by common feelings, the one landsman in the entire world that holds Jack's highest respect. Now Jack's a little bit shaken hearing how subjugated Stephen is by Diana, how much doubt Stephen clearly feels. The text says, He, meaning Jack, would not have been more at a loss if he had found the surprise deprived of her anchors, ballast, and compass.
Hmm.
And Jack is learning, the same thing that we learned throughout the canon. We are all of us human. One of the things that I think O'Brien does such a good job with. Well, I was kind of scratching my head. Molina, possibly according to the P.O.B. Muster book, Luis Molina, a Spanish Jesuit theologian who in 1588 made a famous controversial attempt to reconcile the seemingly opposed doctrines of free will and predestination.
Ooh.
What role does destiny have? And I thought, that would be very appropriate for this chapter
really
here.
would.
I think we have a lot of that going on here. And then Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And boy, that's huge, as is Aristotle's next treatise on ethics. So, there's just so much to choose from there. And I think a lot that Stephen would admire and emulate in this treatise, and a lot that we see O'Brien bringing out in the text here. One of the things Aristotle emphasizes is this importance of practical wisdom here. And Matron, both as a physician and an intelligence agent, is always applying this. He's got to make these quick, thoughtful decisions. He navigates these complex scenarios with a blend of scientific knowledge and this practical wisdom that, is Aristotle's ideal of a virtuous individual who acts rightly, not just by following the rules, but understanding the nuances of each situation.
Yeah.
We can't think about how many times O'Brien points to Stephen being a physician, kind of in the history of the great physicians who didn't just go by the theoretical things of the day, but learned by what they were doing, more empirical at that. Well, you could have all the virtue ethics, all the interest in human well-being and happiness that Aristotle talks about, that it's not just ourselves, but acting in a way that helps others. Certainly, Stephen embodies all that. But Aristotle takes a good bit of time talking about friendship and three types of friendship. Yeah, and I think, we get to the heart of it here. There's friendship based on utility. What can you do for me? And what can I do for you? Pleasure. And then the highest form of friendship, a virtue of the goodness of character. You are the highest form of friendship, the highest, sort of the most profound friendship, when there is this mutual respect and admiration for each other. And this character, this virtue plays a role. It's not just utilitarian. It's not based on pleasure, but deeply rooted in shared values and virtues, which Aristotle considers essential for a flourishing life. And I think, O'Brien shows us this throughout the canon. It's one of the things that we've talked about so often with so many of our guests here. It's this friendship that brings us. So we've got all of these things of Aristotle's that Stephen could be talking about, but I can't help but feel that, O'Brien is also ringing the bell early in the canon here, going, this is what this is about here.
Yeah. And it's funny, we've talked on other occasions about sources for some of the situations and personalities that O'Brien puts into the books. And we've sometimes wondered to ourselves, what's the source of the friendship? Was there an individual friendship that it was in O'Brien's life? And I don't think we necessarily have to find a friendship that O'Brien had, because he was a well-read guy. And maybe in setting up the friendship between Stephen and Jack, he's not saying, I had, or I believe that I had a friendship with one other man that was like this. Maybe he's just saying, I really, really have read and get Aristotle's points about the deepness of friendship. And although I may never have experienced one, I want to write about a friendship that models that, because it's important to me. And that counts for me just as great as a source as saying that there was only one real life model for Jack Aubrey.
Oh, Aristotle wouldn't necessarily, applaud me saying amen, but I will say
okay. Fantastic. So he has been able to recite the Nicomachean Ethics, which sounds like a prodigy, right? This is a towering work of memory and understanding. He must have covered the ethics and politics as well, which I think is the other topic that's in the Nick and McCain ethics. But now he starts talking directly in Latin. Good news for us, as perhaps not entirely Latin familiar readers. He comes out with a quote with a tag that we've heard before. He says, "Arma virumque cano," of arms and the man, or of war and the man I sing, which, of course, is Virgil. It's from the Aeneid. That delights Jack. Not because he loves Virgil and the Aeneid, but because he knows that now that Stephen's talking in Latin, nobody else overhearing is going to understand it. Long may this last, thinks Jack to himself, at least until the equatorial channel, when the morning watch hears the ominous words from Stephen in Latin, "Ast illi solvuntur frigore membra vitaque cum gemitu fugit indignata sub umbras." And I've no idea if I've mangled the pronunciation or not. We need to dig into a translation for that, because it's way beyond my kind of casual Latin. This great outpouring of Latin is followed by an indignant cry for tea, for green tea. Stephen's going, is nobody else in this ship able to do the elementary basics for fixing a fever, for fixing a calenture? So, Mike, we know that Arma virumque cano is from the Aeneid. It turns out that this longer quote, "Ast illi solvuntur frigore," is actually the closing line of this great poem. And the translation reads, "But his limbs became numb with the cold, and his life, disdaining to bear this, fled down into the shadows with a sigh." Wow. So this is a line about death.
Yeah.
And we reached out to our consulting medieval Latinist, Karen Ruff, not only for help with the text, but just like help with how much of a work of memory would it have been to have known this? And Stephen here is talked about as having recited this all from memory. And we got some great points from Karen. Hello, Karen. Thank you once again, as always, for your thoughts here. The Aeneid, of course, is in verse. So that makes it probably easier to memorize than, for example, the Nicomachean Ethics, which would be in Greek or in translated English, but clearly not in verse. The entire Aeneid is about 7 or 8 times longer in terms of word count than a typically long Shakespearean role, which an actor might easily carry by memory 7 or 8 of in their heads. If you're a professional lifelong Shakespearean actor, you can probably recite a lot of the roles that you have from the memory that's kind of tattooed on your soul. So the word from Karen is, maybe at a push, this is doable, especially if the recall is amped up a little bit by Stephen's unconscious fevered state here. It could, says Karen, take up to 14 hours to recite the original with a decent meter. Mike, I think you tried listening to translations, or at least skimming through translations of the Aeneid on Audible. How did that come out?
Well, and that ran somewhat shorter. Some almost as long, some in as little as 8 hours. But again, that's the English translation. So, we don't know how much they're abridging that. And but I do think it's interesting to think about, as Karen did, are there parallels here?
Right.
Is there any reason other than, we've heard Diana's mad cousin, reciting these lines before? We hear the Aeneid come up so often in the course of the canon here. And this last line that Karen translates a little bit differently, she says, "But his limbs dissolve in cold, and his outraged life flees with a groan to the shades." And, I'm thinking, wow. Now, she says there's this duel that this is talking about between Aeneas and Turnus in the ending lines of the Aeneid. So, this is the way Virgil's heroic epic ends, with this groan of an outraged shade. And she says it kind of, while their duel isn't necessarily alike, it does sound a little bit like Stephen's mood at the end of his duel.
Yeah.
And it does also, that even the context of the duel in the Aeneid reminds us of sort of the fatal jealousy and the outraged honor that kind of led to the duel, even though Stephen's feeling differently at the end of it. Karen writes, a duel that neither person felt could be avoided, but that ends in the waste of a life. It's a very deflating way to end, just like the Aeneid is kind of a very deflating way to end. There's a lot of controversy. Scholars have debated this, but some people think that perhaps Virgil just died, and that's why the Aeneid stops here,
Right.
doesn't carry on. And then, as Kara says, well, it's something poignant to think about as we move very quickly towards our reading of O'Brien's 21 together.
Wow.
So we might have a similar ending coming up.
That's superb. And we're in the final chapter of the book here. And at least from Stephen's perspective, we've got death, cold, and dark. And let's go all the way back to the beginning of the book. Stephen's kind of return to life after the escapade in Minorca was about heat and light. So we've had this journey for Stephen's character from restoration and life and heat and light to cold and shade and darkness and death, at least in the way that this quote is taking us, where we're not all the way through the chapter yet. But it's a pretty downbeat moment here. Now, Stephen, as we said, Mike, has woken up from his memory feat. He's calling out for green tea. O'Brien tells us that it could be green tea, or it could be a change in the wind, or the intercession of Stephen's patron, that's Saint Stephen. One of those things, at any rate, has brought about a lowering of Stephen's temperature. Every hour it's getting a little bit back more to normal. His fever is subsiding. McAllister has been keeping it down with bark. So it's not only fate that is healing Stephen, but the practicalities, back to the practical wisdom of Aristotle earlier on. McAllister has been being practical here and helping to reduce the inflammation. Coming along with Stephen's returning health is, we've seen this before, the kind of peevishness that only Stephen can deliver to us. And Jack finds this just as taxing as sitting through a recitation of the Aeneid from memory in Latin. He's amazed, though, to see the way that the seamen, including Killick and Bondon, put up with all of this grumpy abuse from Stephen. Stephen, while no doubt a great physician, a practitioner of all the virtue that we've talked about with Aristotle, he is a wretched, wretched patient. Poor old Chaplain White, the vicar, the parson, who spends more time with Stephen than most people, given his duty to visit the sick, finally quits after Stephen made some kind of fling about Erastianism. We'll come to Erastianism in a second. But he's even managed to push away at arm's length the one person who's duty-bound to help him out. White decides to focus his efforts, and having been accused by Stephen of not trying at a game of chess, goes right ahead and manages to beat Stephen at a game of chess. And this gives him the opprobrium of the whole of the rest of the crew. The helmsman, the quartermaster, the gunroom, even the captain rebuke White for taking it upon himself to beat this poor invalid at chess. So there's no way poor old White can win in this situation. You know, you're damned if you are and you're damned if you don't. If he'd lost to Stephen instead in this chess game, Stephen would likely have cried out that White wasn't paying attention and flown into a passion. So he was going to get it from either side. Perhaps that's the destiny of clerics in the world of Patrick O'Brien. Anyhow, Stephen was making this remark directed at White about Erastianism. Can you help us out there, Mike, with what's going on with Erastianism?
You bet. Yeah, interestingly, Thomas Erastus, was a 16th century Swiss physician and theologian, and he argued that, where you have a state that all citizens share a single religion, that all offenses, whether they're civil or ecclesiastical, should be tried by the state. Well, this doctrine quickly evolved into its modern form and states that the state's authority in all legal matters are always and everywhere superior to that of the church. So I'm sure as a good member of the clergy, that would be a little irritating to White here. That from our Patrick O'Brien muster book.
Wow. Well, thank you, Thomas Erastus. I think we've covered a lot of ground so far in this chapter, Mike. All of this is giving me a raging thirst. So I don't know about you, but maybe we should take a short break and hope that our listeners will do the same. And we'll be right back to you in just a couple of minutes.
Welcome back. Hope that your thirst is somewhat slated here. We've moved on a bit. It's a week later. Surprise stops at an uninhabited island in the Indian Ocean, whose longitude, Jack finds, is listed differently on every chart that he has. And Jack, he's on this hydrographical mission. He wants to go ashore and record the correct position for all times. Let's resolve this here. And O'Brien tells us that this is a day, in his words, to be marked with a white stone, a white boulder. Indeed, it's the day, O'Brien tells us, that Stephen makes the most important discovery of his life. And I'm thinking, wow. I had to quick go back and go, like, marked with a white stone. I remember people kind of leaving stones for memorial things. What is this? A white stone indicates days that are very fortunate, that are to be remembered with gratitude. Romans would use white chalk or stone to mark their lucky days on their stone calendars, while marking their unlucky days with charcoal. So, the white versus the dark, light versus the dark. That, according to informationplease.com.
Wow, good job. On the island now, Stephen is set down on the fern-covered root seat of an ancient tree. There are 14 kinds of orchids within reach here, so this is a great spot, well chosen for Stephen. And meanwhile, the crew goes to survey and perform astronomical observations. And Mike, I did have a little bit of a moment here when I recollected that the last person who was brought ashore to be put down in any kind of medical distress was Mr. Envoy Stanhope, and we all know how that ended up for him. But the attention turns not to Stephen's health, but to the astronomical observations that are going on here. A hush comes down over the group that's assembled on the beach, led by Jack. It's on an area of level sand, and Jack reads figures off to his clerk, and finally compares his own observations with the observations made in duplicate by Staunton at the same time. They agree exactly. Jack says, it's a most satisfactory observation, the most satisfactory observation, in fact, that he's ever made, and walks off to tell Stephen. So, crudely, what he's been doing is using a rapidly changing astronomical distance, I think a distance between Venus and the moon, to get a good idea of time. If you can measure that distance, you can get a good handle on where you are in absolute time. So what that allows him to do is to lay down the longitude of this island precisely by getting what is in effect a really, really good time signal from the universe by happening to be able to measure this distance. Now, having been able to measure that, he thinks that he's made a discovery. Well, what he's done in effect is reinforce somebody else's discovery by pinning down the exact latitude and longitude of this island. Stephen, though, can top it because he's discovered a whole new species. Stephen is there with what, from the writer's point of view, from Jack's point of view, is called just a monstrous thing. And Jack has to ask what it is. And here's Stephen, clearly back to full health because he's in full zoological flow and also gently roasting his friend. It is a tortoise, my dear, the great land tortoise of the world, a new genus. He is unknown to science, and in comparison to him, your giants of Rodriguez and Aldabra are inconsiderable reptiles. He must weigh a ton. I do not know that I have ever been so happy. I am in such spirits, Jack. How you will ever get him aboard, I cannot tell. But nothing is impossible to the Navy. And now Jack comes back with, must we get him aboard? Oh, no question about it. He is to immortalize your name. This is testudo obrei for all eternity. When the hero of the Nile, he means Nelson, when the hero of the Nile is forgotten, Captain Aubrey will live on in his tortoise. There's glory for you. And I love it. I think there's part of this which is Stephen sincerely trying to give the greatest honor he possibly can to his friend. Yeah, but a little bit of a leg pull at the same time at Jack for being so much enthralled to Nelson. Anyhow, it's a very, very sincere compliment getting a new tortoise species named after you. I don't think anybody's ever done that for me.
Well, in addition to taking his, named after his particular friend tortoise with him, he's also worried that if they leave him there, this trusting creature is, what's going to happen to him once people start coming to this place, as they might now that its location is fixed. Well, Jack says, perhaps we'll parbuckle him down the beach and then we can get him aboard. So, Jack's talking about using this combination of rope slings. And Stephen declares that this tortoise has, in his own words, quite recovered him. And he walks, as Jack's walking along, Stephen is walking along, now with his arm resting on this enormous upper shell of Testudo Aubria.
Yeah.
Well, McAllister, back on board, observes that the tortoise has, in his words, turned the scale.
Ho, ho,
And
ho.
I'm thinking, we don't get Jack to laugh at this like a curtailed watch here. It's doing more good, says McAllister, than anything in his medicine chest to improve Stephen's health. Now, Stephen is happy. The surprises are all happy because they're making great time and everyone knows they're homeward bound. Soon they're going to see wives and sweethearts, and the captain will presumably be getting married here. Now, Jack, actually, for his own self, is happy not only for the thought of Sophie, but the thought of the opportunity to return while the war is still there, for the possibility of real distinction, and for prizes then and on the way as well. With all the company's fine naval stores, all these things they got in their refitting, she's doing almost as well as in the days of her youth, except for some of the deep structural defects that have come from her age and from the pounding she took from the Rango. Well, the hands are now working together better than ever, having gone through this defense of the China fleet, having gone through everything they've been through in this journey. And everybody is now logging 200 miles of pure urgent sailing day after day.
It's a really beautiful moment. And O'Brien loves to bring us back to these episodes of just when the sailing is great and the weather is good and the crew is in harmony. He uses the same words just to bring us back to the same state. And it's really beautiful. The voyage is continuing at quite a pace here. We're still many, many thousands of miles from home, but O'Brien is letting the miles flow past us quite quickly. Pretty soon, we meet foreign merchant ships on the way. We get news of the Lushington. She's now only 700 miles ahead. The sea grows cooler, which means we're getting down past the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. They hear the barking of penguins, and they reach the westerlies. So we're probably now getting down towards 40 south, getting towards the real change of climate. And since they're still trying to make westing, they have to beat up constantly against this barrier of air as birds, as petrels, and albatrosses come and join them. Meanwhile, they're eating their way through their supplies as well. The gunroom and the captain's cabin are down to salt beef and ship's bread, just like the foremast hands. The good old tortoise has long been struck down into the hold. I guess he's hibernating. I don't know. And they round the Cape with Stephen, meanwhile, gaining strength and sorting through all of the collections and specimens. So, Mike, in just a couple of paragraphs here, it feels like the Surprise is sort of setting itself back to rights, and the people aboard the Surprise are setting themselves back to rights as well.
Yeah, and they're even happier and more merry as they start to head north at last. So we've now been through those 40s. We're back up. They're singing on the forecastle, especially after they pick up the blessed trade winds. Jack says that St. Helena, they'll probably see her soon. And Stephen says, well, don't you want to stop? Not even for some bullocks, some good eating here. And Jack sets Stephen straight. He says, and if you think there's any device, any ruse that can take you ashore to collect bugs, pray think again. Jack's not stopping for anything here. And Pullings, we learned, had hoped to show Stephen this cross between an owl and a pole parrot with a curious bill that he had seen when he was last on the island here. Well, they do slow long enough to signal the signal station there, and they find that Surprise has no mail for them and that the Lushington had just passed by on the 7th with all well on the Lushington. And Jack's now wondering, wait a minute, if Muffet is there, I wonder if he risked the Mozambique Channel, to still be that far ahead of them.
Yeah. Not the first time and not the last time that Jack has wondered whether he's really striking the balance of risk right here. But we're not going to dwell on that for now because the new day dawns. It's a dawn that O'Brien describes as having an exquisite purity that is frightening. The perfection must break and fade. So he's raising the expectation already that the perfection of the dawn must surely lead to some kind of imperfection, some kind of downfall in the day. And what it brings us is the spotting on the horizon of a sail, a man of war, a frigate. The crew is very excited. They prepare to clear for action as they come down and bear down on this this strange sail. However, they make the private signal, they make their number, and they learn that it's a British frigate, the Lachesis. I hope I'm saying it right, to all of you Greek scholars out there. Jack hopes that by stopping and speaking with the Lachesis, they might get some news from home. But Lachesis signals that she's charged with dispatches, is not stopping, nobody's allowed to stop her. Jack signals to ask in passing about mail. No mail for the Surprise. Now, there was no Royal Navy ship of this name, although the Royal Navy was very much given in many times in history to naming ships after characters from Greek mythology, and this is a Greek name. Lachesis, though, was the middle of the three fates in ancient Greece, and she measures a thread of a person's life that is being spun by her younger sister. And in some versions of the mythology, she, Lachesis, chooses a person's destiny after the life thread has been measured. So, Mike, very, very subtle, very, very deep here. A bit of a signal, perhaps, that fate might be about to intervene in some aspect of our story here.
Well, yeah, especially coming on the heels of Melita.
Yeah.
Just a few chapters back that we're echoing this fate theme here. Well, again, no mail. And Jack curses this ship as a slab-sided tub. And at dinner, he's reflecting on this, keep getting mail, no news. And he tells Stephen he wishes they didn't have a parson aboard. And that even though Mr. White is a very good fellow and he'd be happy to serve with him in any capacity ashore, it just doesn't do for being on a ship. Jack says, well, now, I'm not superstitious, but it makes the hands uneasy. But he says, I wouldn't have a parson on any ship if I could help it. They're out of place on a man of war with all their turn the other cheek, something that just doesn't do for battle here. And Jack also mentioned that he didn't care for the ill-looking bird that had crossed their bow just as he was coming down. So Jack moving into superstition mode here, I think.
Right. Of course, what Stephen tells him next is the wrong thing. What Stephen should have said is, it's not an ill-looking bird, it's a metaphor. But he doesn't.
Right. Yeah. Right.
He says it's a common booby from a nearby island. He's astonished, he says, that Navy's men with a liberal education at their disposal are so weak to believe in bugaboos like omens from flying birds. He points out that despite Jack's desire to get to Madeira as fast as possible, Jack had chosen not to set sail on a Friday and excused it by making some remark about the capstan needing repair. Stephen says, maybe that's just for the sake of the men. Are you claiming that? And he says, ha, 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 if that's the case. Jack, you are as superstitious as everybody else believes you really are. Now, Jack decides he's going to dig in and defend some of his superstitions. You may not believe some of these things, says Jack, but I could tell you stories that would raise the wig off your head. All of the Navy's omens, Stephen points out, foretell disaster. And given how many men they've had huddled together on ships, spending all their spare time beating each other's brains out, any gloomy forecast about the fate of a ship is likely to come true. So if you're on a ship, stands to reason you're going to get bombarded or wrecked. So it's not really a great act of foretelling to say, oh, bad things are going to happen. However, the cause of the tragedy here is not a corpse or the parson or St. Elmo's fire.
Well, Jack is reacting to Stephen saying, ha, ha, ha. He says, I would say, ha, ha, ha. You're thinking that sailors have a liberal education. Yeah. We're all educated at sea from a very young age, like I was. There's not much in terms of a professional or a liberal education. All they're educated on is their profession. And then Jack goes off on that subject. He says, we're not the sort of men that educated, intelligent, well-brought-up young women cross 1,000 miles of sea for. They only marry us if they do it right away. And he says, if we board them in our own smoke. And then Jack's quote is, given time to reflect, as often as not, they marry parsons or clever chaps at the bar.
Ooh. So it's funny, we've had most of this chapter so far with Jack being in reasonably positive spirits, setting aside him having to spend time nursing Stephen. But all of a sudden we get from him here this sign that he's worried that things might not be going well for him with Sophie. And Stephen says, well, you love Sophie. Loving her itself is a liberal education. So therefore, you're an educated man. He's saying, so stow all of this nonsense about you being low status and, at risk from being cut out by lawyers and priests. He also says he has the benefit. Now, this is definitely a roast. You've got the benefit of being a sea officer. You've been schooled to mute obedience. You'll make a much better husband than a lawyer who's constantly prating, that is to say, constantly talking away. It's a very kind effort by Stephen, I think, to try and divert the current of Jack's mind, which is turning a little bit melancholy here. So he concludes by telling Jack the story of a priest who had said that the inhabitants of Ossory can change into wolves at their pleasure. And Mike, this is a complete handbrake turn of a reference. We've gone from a gentle leg pull of Jack Aubrey and sailors make great husbands to werewolves. Can you help us out with where the connection might lie here?
I had exactly the same reaction that you did. I was like, what? That just seemed completely random. And of course, this is O'Brien. It's not random at all. The Ossory werewolves are in many, many, many tales. There's many stories about them. But the one Stephen's referring to, he said specifically, came from Gerald of Wales. Now, Stephen used the priest's Latin name there. And this story of Gerald of Wales is completely different from the other stories. The other stories are about kind of the men of that part of Ireland dressing in wolf skins, their ferocity in battle. But this one is actually part of a 12th century book, the Topographia Hibernia.
Wow.
And it's about a man's love for his female partner. And it's kind of returned to this theme that we've had in the book about kind of the good and bad of religious beliefs and different religious leaders and actions that Stephen would find very interesting indeed. In the story, there's this priest traveling in Ireland. He kind of gets lost in the woods. He's frightened by a wolf, but the wolf starts to talk to him. He says, don't be afraid. He talks to him about God. And he explains that this other saint and abbot has actually started doing this to his people, that he turns one man and one woman, a couple, into wolves for 7 years. And if they happen to survive, then another couple replaces them after the 7 years, and they can return to being a man and woman again. But he says right now, his partner's not surviving. She's laying dangerously sick. And of course, no one will say last rites for a wolf. Well, this priest who doesn't want to get eaten and is kind of a little bit in awe listening to this talking wolf goes and offers to say last rites for her. And before he does so, the wolf pulls down his partner's wolf skin to show the priest this old woman, this old human woman kind of underneath it. And after the service, the male wolf leads the priest out of the woods and starts portraying to him many prophecies about the future of Ireland and its English invaders. This is just the time of sort of the Normans coming through here. Now, the priest is then sent to talk to the Pope about all this. And so this werewolf story, so unlike the other stories, may be a commentary on the Norman conquest of Ireland and the transformation of Ireland's church. But is also this, So you can tell Stephen, you can tell O'Brien would be fascinated by it. And we've got this great thing about this love of a man for a woman. And it doesn't matter their status, as you were saying, Ian, a bit ago. So not quite the handbrake turn that we've seen.
No. And if you want to look for it, a little tiny echo back to the bear suit of Post-Captain.
Yes. Yes. So well spotted. Absolutely.
So it's another great example. And I'm feeling sad about the fact that we're counting down now the last few times that we'll be able to dig into one of these wonderful references from Patrick O'Brien and see all this great context lying underneath it. So Stephen's been trying to cheer Jack up in a sort of odd reversal of the roles here. And he returns to his specimen feeling upset that he's been so fixed upon seeing Diana in Madeira that he hadn't thought about how Jack's got his own anxieties regarding meeting Sophie there. He hadn't seen that actually this is an anxiety that they have in common as they get closer and closer to Madeira. He also has a sense and maybe along with all the other metaphors and symbols that have been kind of flung at us in the last few pages here, he has a sense that maybe the happiness of the traveling that they've done for the last few months might be about to get broken. Not so much impending doom as a feeling of uneasiness that Stephen can't define. And he thinks that Jack has been a little bit guilty of saying things out loud that bring in bad luck. When Jack had said, they marry parsons, Stephen thought that was a very unlucky stroke. He says, absit omen, another piece of Latin in a chapter that's pretty crammed with Latin, which translates roughly as, let it not be an omen. So it's a call for divine protection from the evil that we might just have invoked here. For, as O'Brien goes on to explain in the text, the deepest of his private superstitions or ancestral pieties was naming calls. In other words, speak of the devil, and there he shall be.
Right. He who shall not be named.
Yeah.
Right.
So Stephen decides he's got to go and dig in a little bit more to this worry that Jack has about parsons and lawyers and clever fellows. Very brave of him to do this, and I don't know why it occurred to him. Never mind. He went to see Mr. White and said, have you ever met Charles Hinksey? Hinksey, of course, being the parson who's been kind of rolling his eyes at Sophie Williams ashore for a book and a half now. Hinksey, says White, yes, I went to school with him. Delightful person, well connected now, has 2 great livings. That is to say, he's the beneficiary of 2 parishes that are really well provided for financially. Is so nice, however, that no one envies him his financial independence. He will be a bishop soon, and that will be good for the church. Stephen is a bit worried by this. He says, well, doesn't he have any faults? Oh, no, says Parson White, no faults. But people would still like him even if he did have faults. He's tall, he's handsome, and in a very, very insensitive and ill-thought-out remark here, Mr. White says, I'm at a loss to explain how he's escaped marriage, given the great number of caps set in his direction. And he goes on and explains that Hinksey would be happy to be married, but he is hard to please. And it's sad, but it's also funny just how much bad news there is for Jack Aubrey in this incidental throwaway commentary on the virtues and privileges of Mr. Hinksey here.
Well, the days continue to fly by, and both Stephen and Jack have this increasing tension as they get closer to Madeira. O'Brien calls it dread of the event combining with the delight. Now, the island is this there. It's lying to the north against a menacing sky, and rain pours down on the newly painted ship's side. So once again, O'Brien just say, let me set the scene for you, just so you know how this is going to work out. Well, in the morning, they enter. They see many other ships, including 3 Indiamen, but not the Lushington. The surprise salutes the castle. The salute is returned. And then Jack hears another salute beginning, turns to kind of look for another ship entering there, but realizes it's the Indiamen who are saluting the surprise. They must have heard about the Linois story from Muffet. Now, Stephen, as they're debarking, is so hesitant to go ashore that Bondon thinks, he just can't physically do it, and is starting to place each of Stephen's footfalls, but it's Stephen's nerves here, what he's going to find. Well, they go to Jack's prize agent straight away. There's no mail for surprise, and he doesn't know anything about a young lady that's arrived for Captain Aubrey. So Jack says, well, can I read over? Do you have the Indiaman's passenger list? And he's reading over all these things. Then he sees Mrs. Villiers. And then 2 lines below that, Mr. Johnstone. But there's no Miss Williams on any of the ships. Again, he's asking about mail. And the agent says, oh, wait. There was a note from one of the Lushington's passengers for a Dr. Matron. And Stephen takes it. He recognizes Diana's handwriting. And he feels through the envelope the ring that he had given Diana, kind of the ring, representing their betrothal. And he just tells Jack, you have to excuse me. I'm going to take a turn. I'm going for a walk here.
Wow. Poor Stephen. This is not omen. This is not superstition. This is cold, hard reality. And we're not going to hear about the details, but he's been let down. by the woman that he's pursued with so much dedication. He walks steadily uphill. Madeira is a very hilly island. He's climbing up past fields and orchards and vineyards and forest, right above the vegetation line to the volcanic scree on the central ridge of the island. He's above the snow line now, and he pushes handfuls of snow into his mouth to help rehydrate for all of the water in his body that he has wept and sweated out as he has climbed. He's walked himself into what O'Brien calls a dull apathy, into this kind of senseless state. Reminds me a little bit, Mike, of the very detached state that he was in before the planned duel with Jack Aubrey. He's beyond the immediate feeling of the cold wind, beyond the feeling of wet on his cheeks. He's kind of floating free. The sun is on its way down. It's only a hand's breadth above the horizon, and he sees the shadow of complete darkness over all the ravines below him. So we've got light failing, we've got cold and darkness enveloping Stephen Maturin. If you wanted anything about symbols in the environment to give you a clue about what we're meant to feel here, it's all here in the text. Stephen looks about him and says to himself in this rather detached way, to get down, that will be a problem. Any man can go up, almost indefinitely. But to go down and down sure-footed, that is another thing entirely. And there's a delicious sort of dual meaning here. He might have been talking about walking back down the mountain as the darkness settles in. But I guess he's also talking about his relationship with Diana, descending from the heights of believing that there was love there for him into the depths of, the opposite of all the ecstasy of love, I guess. Not the only time we're going to have the up-down symbolism either. We'll see some more of that later in the canon. But it's absolutely that on the heights of the mountain, the pits of despair for Stephen Maturin. And he finally turns and opens the letter. It was his duty to read the letter, of course, and in the last gleam of day he took it from his pocket. The tearing of the paper, a cruel sound. He read it with a hard, cruel severity, yet he could not prevent a kind of desperate tenderness creeping over his face at the end. But it would not do. Weakness would never do. And with the same appearance of indifference, he looked about for a hollow in the rocks where he could lie. And Stephen stays on the mountain top there, asleep through the night in a hollow in the rocks, like a monk, just out there in the wilderness, in dead sleep, a total absence. And again, we've got cold and darkness and sleep and death, all really, really strongly signified here. It's a grim moment for Stephen. It's a grim moment for all of us who are on Team Stephen.
And then in this masterful stroke, O'Brien then kind of recreates his opening of chapter 5, but in reverse. This time, instead of looking at where they're going, the surprise is going to be going when we remember the sun having, we're following its journey till it hits the surprise. Now we're summarizing where they've been. O'Brien writes, the circling sun, having lit Calcutta and then Bombay, came up on the other side of the world and blazed full upon his upturned face, bringing him back into himself by force. Wow. I thought, wow. And Stephen is just sleep dazed. He knows he's in extreme pain, but he can't remember why. And the pieces of memory start to fall back in place. And then he buries the ancient small iron ring, the one he had given Diana, that he still has clasped in his hand. The text tells us that the letter had already blown away, and Stephen now finds the last patch of snow with the sun coming up to wash his face.
And Mike, if you're making a movie, I slightly wish that they hadn't used the Thomas Tallis fantasy in the original Peter Weir movie. This is the moment where you should play the Thomas Tallis Fantasia, because it's such a profound moment.
Wow.
It's a little bit like the opposite of the cowboy hero riding into the sunset. If this was just one novel, this might have been the end of Stephen Maturin, but O'Brien makes the sun rise, makes the sunlight fall on the body of the hero, and the hero somehow has to carry on his journey about the world. And it's really profound, and it tells you everything about the scale of the arc that O'Brien has in mind for Stephen, is that it's not going to end here because the sun has risen again. It's brilliant, brilliant stuff. So with the sunlight now upon Stephen's body and Stephen called back into life, our story gets to go back to the everyday of Stephen and Jack. Stephen's back down in the town on Madeira, finds Jack there, and Jack invites Stephen to have a glass of wine. Jack, of course, not knowing really for sure what was the content of the letter. They sat down, too heavy and stupid to be embarrassed. And then Stephen catches Jack up. Diana has gone to America with this Mr. Johnson. They're going to be married. Her kindness to him in Calcutta, he says, had let his mind run too far, but she was under no engagement to him. This is a very, very pitiable kind of rationalization of the position by Stephen here, but you can see why he does it. It's a bit of self-protection. It was never really meant to be. She was always going to do this. He had been kidding himself, he is saying, by thinking that he had a chance. He says he's not been at all unfairly treated by her. He drinks to her health. And we get no reply in the dialogue here from Jack, which is very important. Simply that they've finished their bottle and another, but it had no effect of any kind. And they rowed back to the ship as silently as they had come. And I'm sure that if I'm Jack Aubrey, I'm 100% there with my friend, and I'm 100% there thinking this stop and this island and this journey, from the true love point of view, is bringing us to nothing. They're wildly disappointed. Despite the fact that they've got all this glory attached to them from the rescue of the China fleet, it seems like we're back again at the scene of the envoy's death, where Stephen had said at the end of basically the previous act of the story, we came on a fool's errand. And maybe here they are, Jack and Stephen, realizing that all of this pursuit, in this case, pursuit of love and of the two women, has been fruitless.
Wow. Well, the surprise stands out to sea. The men are all still happy, but they realize that the captain and the doctor are not. They're listening. They kind of observe there's no ill words between the two of them. And so the crew decides, well, perhaps they had both eaten something that didn't agree with them on shore, and they'll be better in a day or two here. So this crew still tearing high spirits. They're all up for this last leg of the journey. They're looking forward to seeing again their wives and sweethearts, to getting paid, to the return of Fiddler's Green, which is, just over that next horizon, according to the crew.
It's great. The crew are excited, and rather warily, Jack and Stephen join them in this kind of return to commonplace life. Stephen has to prepare his accounting of all of these surgeons and medical expenses and drugstores covering the last 18 months. He even gets to look sidelong at his own private bottle of laudanum and doesn't draw the cork. He says, I no longer need any fortitude. Stephen then, unaided by laudanum, falls asleep sitting up in a chair and sleeps right through Jack's great gun exercise. Another little signal that life aboard ship must go on, and they're both kind of slotting back into their roles, whatever their romantic disappointments might have been. When Stephen wakes, he finds Jack still there doing his own accounting, writing up his remarks for the Admiralty Hydrographer, the cover, as it had been, for this original mission that he had undertaken in the Surprise. Along the way, we learn Jack has become a scientific sailor, and the sighting and the laying down of the longitude for that island in the Indian Ocean was the cap on all of the sort of hydrographic and mathematical achievements that Jack's been building up to so far. Stephen then tells Jack that he's been thinking about Sophie on the mountain. He says he's realized that so many things might have happened to Canning's courier, and this is neither the first nor the last time that they might realize that couriers can be waylaid or let them down. The courier would have been traveling across mountains and desert. Maybe news of Canning's death had actually overtaken the courier and plans had changed. It's very likely, says Stephen, perhaps scraping around for some crumbs of reassurance here, it's very likely that your message never reached Sophie. And Jack takes this for what he thinks it is. He says, I appreciate you giving these kind words and giving me this sound reason. But, says Jack, I learned that my letter reached India House 6 weeks ago. So Sophie, back in England, knows about the situation with the squadron. She has nonetheless still not come out to meet him. They used to call me Lucky Jack Aubrey, you remember, and so I was in my time. But I'm not as lucky as all that. Lord Keith told me luck has its end, and mine is out. I set my sights too high, that's all. What do you say to a tune? With all my heart. And it's a very, very tender moment. Jack is joining Stephen in owning up to the disappointment that he feels about the fact that maybe Sophie's not for him after all. The rain pours outside, and again, rain never pours without a reason. But they, under cover of the cabin, saw through their Corelli and their Hummel, and are about to start their old favourite Boccherini when Jack says, "That was a gun."
A midshipman Knox comes in and reports that Mr. Pullings believes he spotted a sail to leeward. Jack says, oh God, please send me a Frenchman, as he runs up on deck. And Pullings can still see the sail that he'd seen earlier, and he had seen them signaling to some sort of a consort that he can't see. But he wants Jack to have this small triumph of spotting her. So see what you make of it, Captain. Well, Jack does spot her and starts giving orders. He wants to see how close they can come before that ship spots them. He's planning to come across the stranger's wake in the darkness, creep up, and they continue to creep up. With these shaded battle lanterns, the guns all run out, and a break in the cloud shows her to indeed be a frigate. And Jack thinks, I'm going to give her such a broadside in the first moment, and then cross under her stern, rake her twice, maybe 3 times. It's now 3:30 a.m., or as Jack says, 7 bells in the graveyard watch, and still no hail from this ship.
Wow. We've had action so many times before in these situations, and it's what Jack is longing for. And as the sky starts to lighten in the east, Jack is about to complete his preparations and spring his trap. The topsails flash out. They spring up on the quarter of this stranger. There is complete confusion on the other ship. Jack calls out, "What ship is that?" The returning hail comes back. "Euryalus, what ship is that?" It's a British vessel keeping a very, very poor lookout. Jack replies, "Surprise, heave to or be sunk," even though by then, having heard the English hail in return, the real fire in his belly for action has gone out. As they come up, Jack is standing there, larger than life. He sees on the deck of the other ship Captain Miller, far senior to Jack. Miller's standing there on the quarterdeck in his nightshirt. And Jack figures to himself that there's going to be many a bloody back, meaning there will be floggings on board the Euryalus, since the lookouts are going to pay the price for not having seen the surprise coming up on them. Miller is able to stand on his rank, on his seniority above Jack Aubrey. He says, "Where the devil did you come from, and why didn't you make the night signal like a Christian?" I'm not amused, he tells Jack. Some ship arsing about like a jack in the box. He says, "Run down to Ithalion," meaning another ship in the squadron that Euryalus is part of. "Run down to Ithalion and tell him to mend his pace." So what a come down. We were hoping for action and maybe glory and blood and thunder to wipe out Jack's disappointment at the no news from Sophie. And here he is getting scolded by a superior officer, never Jack's favourite way of passing his day. And he's been sent on an errand. Humiliation.
Right. It's just constant. No mail, no woman, no enemy ship here. Well, Surprise runs down as ordered to the shamefully great way off ship. Yeah. Jack makes the private signals. He repeats Captain Miller's orders. And when Ithalian acknowledges, Jack is laying his course for Finisterre. And then the Ithalian starts to signal again. And Church, the guy, the young midshipman who struggles a little bit with signals, is still learning, says, "Captain Surprise, I have 2 women for you. Next hoist, 1 young. Please come to breakfast." And Jack is beside himself. He gets the Surprise moving immediately. He shoots up under the Ithalian's lee. Heneage Dundas calls out, "Good morning, Jack. I have Miss Williams here. Will you come across?" And they drop the boat in. It gets half full of water. They're in this incredible, messy hurry to get across. And Jack, once on the other ship, is led into the cabin, unshaven, unwashed, and ablaze with joy. Jack and Sophie both blush as they curtsy and bow. And Dundas says, I'm going to leave you and see to breakfast.
He's such
and
a subtle
Sophie,
cove, is Henage Dundas.
yeah, don't you just love that? Well done, Henage. Sophie explains that they'd had to chase a privateer almost to the Bahamas. That's why she's not waiting in Madeira, we're thinking here. And Jack says, I've been cursing my parson on board the Surprise for a Jonah, but now I'm so glad he's there. He can marry us this morning.
Yeah, never mind maneuvers, Jack. Go straight at him.
Right.
But she's not having it. She's not having it. Sophie says, I've promised Mother that we'll do it properly at home with her consent, which she will now give. If she doesn't, she says, Sophie will just sail round and round the world with Jack. And this is a really, really great moment. And then she asks how Stephen is. Jack says, oh, God, I'm a selfish brute. The most damn shocking thing has happened. He was longing to marry Diana, but coming home on an Indiaman, she had left at Madeira and bolted with Johnston, with this very rich American. And Jack's appraisal of this is that between the two of them, it's the best thing that could happen for Stephen to get distance from Diana. But he'd give his right hand to have her back because Stephen now looks so low. He says he knows that Sophie will be kind to Stephen, and Sophie's eyes fill with tears just as the maid comes to collect them for breakfast.
Well, after Dundas tells Jack about the privateer that he chased, Jack goes into the details at Dundas's request about the action with Lenoir. And Jack, O'Brien tells us, is positioning pieces of toast with his left hand to represent, just how things lay, while using his right hand to hold Sophie's hand under the table. Sophie listens, O'Brien writes, with eager intelligence and a firm grasp of the weather gauge. Yeah. So, if we're wondering if Sophie is the right gal, clearly, eager intelligence and a firm grasp of the weather gauge. What else could a man ask for here? And the meal comes to a close with Captain Miller's repeated guns. Get up here, get up here. Jack called for a bosun's chair to be rigged, and while it was preparing, Stephen and Sophie waved to one another without a pause, smiling and crying out, "How are you, Stephen? How are you, my dear?" Jack says to Henage, "I'm so very obliged to you, so deeply obliged. Now I have but to run Sophie and my treasure home, and the future is pure paradise." End of HMS Surprise.
Oh, Mike, what a moment. Really, really great. And we've got a few things to talk about, but I just love how, besides this beautiful wrapping up of this story here and the great payoff for Jack and Sophie, just halfway through the chapter with the story of Stephen and the sunrise on the mountain, he's also set us looking ahead at a story arc that's still to come. And is the future pure paradise? I think even only 3 books into the canon, we've learned enough about Patrick O'Brien to know that he's got plenty of time to play with us and to play with Jack and Stephen's future a little bit. But for now, I'm sitting here applauding Jack and Sophie, really hoping that there's something new for Stephen coming in the future here.
Yeah. I'm just so grateful that we had this chance to go back and do HMS Surprise at the slow pace. I mean, even from the opening of this chapter, like we've said in so many chapters, it's the Patrick O'Brien magic, and it's the magic throughout. Again, we keep saying this is sort of like the mini canon, almost every chapter here. That little scene between Jack and Diana, just only a paragraph or two, with this incredible plumbing of the depths of their characters and their flaws. And we see Jack, in book 3, having matured so much, looking at himself so much more deeply. We see through Diana's eyes the ways he's matured and the ways he hasn't. And even though Diana had been completely rocked in her world there, she still shows her strength, even though, physically she is both, as we saw through Jack's eyes, perfect and frail. And the brilliant foreshadowing of just that little bit to start us rolling. Oh my gosh.
It's fantastic. And it's funny, I'd forgotten, kind of, that Stephen's self-surgery happens at this point in the closing chapter of HMS Surprise. And if you look at it, he's been playing in this last chapter, and you could say all the way through the book, with these little role reversals, these kind of rocking backwards and forwards between the roles that people have, between the friendships, between the lovers, between the subordinates and commanders, all these little playings with these relationships. None of them are fixed. Not even character is fixed, but they're all growing and they're all maturing. Stephen gets to turn surgeon on himself. Jack gets to be the one worried about a potentially lost love, even if it's only for a few pages in this chapter. And in the context of all of that that's growing and evolving, we've got this great friendship, and we've had a big, strong hint about O'Brien's benchmark for friendship when we got that connection to Aristotle and ethics. And it's just beautiful the way he's continued to unfurl these characters and given them the chance to play out in these different worlds. And speaking of worlds, I remember us saying right at the beginning of this book, Mike, how Master and Commander and Post Captain had both been in the kind of fairly constrained European world, in fact, mostly in the Western Mediterranean. And he's done a fantastic job in this book of not only painting all this lush, evocative, scary picture of the wide world of the Far East and India, but he's put our characters in it and shown them facing up to all the kind of the terror and the beauty of the whole world. And again, like that sets the expectation, I think, for all of the terror and beauty that's to come in the novels in the rest of the canon.
Yeah. I can't help but agree with you, Ian. And I'm thinking, and this is another great chapter that shows without a lot of action, if you will, no cannon smoke, not the usual of the genre. There is this subtle ratcheting up of tension, this thing that, we kept leading up thinking, oh, it might happen. No, it didn't. It might happen. And it's both on the personal level as well as on the, ship sightings. And this idea that Jack may have there at the end lost Sophie to the parson back home, when in fact, what an incredible diversion. It's Stephen who's lost Diana. You never can take any of it for granted here. It's part of why we never know what to expect with O'Brien, because he writes the buildups so masterfully. And like life, many of the things we worry about never come to be, right. But some do. It is right between our eyes. Others catch us completely unawares, but not completely, as we see kind of the little subtle foreshadowing in our lives and in the book here. And so often our lives, like Jack and Stephen arriving at Madeira, are this mixture of joyful anticipation, dread, foreboding, and the tension playing out between them all. I remember us starting this in the pandemic.
Yeah.
And, I look back now, I think, how fulfilling and feeding us this is. But then again, I think so is every circumnavigation. Yeah. It just happens to be in a different context. Wow.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? We talked about foreshadowing. We talked about Chekhov's gun quite a few times. And you can kind of see that as a sort of plot twist trick for like a detective story. Did you spot in the opening scene that the murder weapon was there? But you're right, this is much more profound. This foreshadowing says that all these little symbols and devices are around us in life the whole time. And hints about what might be coming around the corner for us are there in our own character and in our own environment and the characters of the people that are around us. And like you say, that elevates the novels from simply a travel log or simply a military drama up to the level of being real novels about human life.
Right.
Right. So where have we got to in the end, would you say, the end of this book of HMS Surprise?
Well, it is one of my favorite books in the canon. Yeah, it always has been. It's that one that I'd always say, what, if you don't want to start with these first two, you might want to start here, knowing a little bit about what came before. And there is a part of me that wishes we could just end here.
Yes.
It's so good to be back in Surprise at our slower pace here. But I don't know, Ian, how about you as we wrap up HMS Surprise?
Well, let's take a look at what our plans contain, because I'm sure everybody listening to this, especially if you're listening to us in real time, is aware right now we're middle of August. We're in the final few weeks of the Lubber's Hole project. And we think you've heard most of this before, but let's just lay out for you how we're going to take our final steps towards our reading of 21, because that's going to be our final act together on the podcast, is to read and talk about the unfinished final 21st book. Next week, we're going to follow up on a great suggestion that we got from our Patreon supporters. You all said we should think about making a comparison with Jane Austen. So for 1 week, with something a little bit special and a little bit different, we're going to dig into the most naval of Jane Austen's novels. We're going to talk about Persuasion. And I'm going to say right now, if you want to join us in next week's Jane Austenizing, you could do a lot worse than going online, going to YouTube or wherever you get your videos online and look for I think it's 1995 BBC movie adaptation of Persuasion. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to refer to the movie and we're going to refer to the things that we notice and that we love as we sit and compare and evaluate Patrick O'Brian and Jane Austen. After that, Mike, we've got 2 weeks to dig into some of the earlier canon of Patrick O'Brian. We've got The Golden Ocean and Unknown Shore. And if you like the characters of Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin, if you like the world of the kind of the Regency era of Jack Aubrey, the world that raised Jack Aubrey, if you've read recently David Grant's excellent book, Wager, you're going to hear some really, really great stuff in Golden Ocean and Unknown Shore. If you've read those books yourself, then I hope you'll enjoy hearing us talk through them at a slightly faster pace. If you haven't read them, then we hope we can entice you to try them out because they're by no means immature books. They're from earlier in Patrick O'Brien's life, but they're really, really great books. Mike, we've got one more big treat in store for the listeners before we get to the end. Do you want to talk us through that?
Well, we do. We have for several years been pursuing Dean King, and that gracious man has graced us with a very long episode. One episode to talk about not only the Patrick O'Brian novels, but Patrick O'Brian himself and Dean King's amazing kind of journey to find out about, In Search of Patrick O'Brian. So can't wait for you to hear that. We just loved it. We've had many, many great conversations with him. He's just a fabulous writer, a fabulous person, and a fellow Chapel Hillian.
Ah. Well, that'll be enough Carolina nostalgia, if such a thing can be said to exist, because our final episode together is going to be 21, the final unfinished voyage of Jack Aubrey. Many people in the world, including myself, have not yet read 21. I've been saving it. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sitting here looking across at my bookshelf. It's on the shelf over there. I've had it for at least 10 years, and I haven't turned a page of it. For you all, together with Mike, we're going to read that and talk about where it leaves us and have our final reflections on the great story and on the great writing of Patrick O'Brian. Of course, there are some things that we might draw upon that have been themes through the whole of the rest of the canon. We talked today about how stories finish, particularly Virgil's Aeneid. We notice as well that the title of the book itself is The Continuing Voyages of Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin, and that maybe there's going to be some hint to us as we get to the end of our Lubber's Hole voyage that voyages continue and that we all are going to continue as writers and enthusiasts and fans of Patrick O'Brian and his work, and that maybe we all together as current listeners and current fans can continue the work of introducing this great literature to other people, to new readers, to new fans, and maybe also keep pursuing the hope that maybe one day some brilliant mind is going to do another round of screenwriting and production to bring these really, really fabulous stories onto the screen. So, Mike, it's not over till it's over, right?
Right. Even though it's getting close, remember to watch or read or both Persuasion for next week. And Ian, let me ask you, what do you say next week to just a little bit more Patrick O'Brian / Jane Austen / Royal Navy through the pen of Jane Austen next time?
Mike, I think that counts as a truth universally acknowledged.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just going down a rabbit hole there looking up something about Venus, but never mind.
Oh, good, good.